Hello and welcome to the Engaging People podcast. My name is Charles Rogel. I'm a consultant here at DecisionWise, joined today by our CEO, Tracy Maylett.
Hi, happy to be here.
Today we're going to be talking about engagement magic, or the framework of magic, which really helps us understand and train on this concept of employee engagement. And as we jump into this, we wanted to kind of give you kind of an overview of kind of the origination, how we came up with the model and the acronym, as well as show or provide some insight in terms of how to use this model to increase engagement as a manager and also in your organization. So, Tracy, as we go through this in our history, DecisionWise, we've been in business now for 25 years. We've conducted employee engagement surveys and employee surveys that during that entire time, but it was a kind of an incremental effort as the model emerged and as we looked at our data to really come up with these magic concepts. And one of the things that we first discovered was that engagement was a lot different than this other concept of satisfaction, and they were quite mingled about 10 years ago as we were kind of going down this path.
Yeah, that's right. We originally started out to understand what creates engagement and what within an organization, what an organization can do, as well as an individual for their own personal engagement. And we stumbled across the concept of magic that we'll talk about here in just a minute. But before we even got there, we realized that engagement was different than satisfaction. So there are certain elements that, when present, it goes along with the idea of Frederick Herzberg's hygiene factors, the two-factor model. The concept that there are certain things that, when present, do not necessarily cause me to be engaged or motivated, but the lack thereof, I pull these away and they cause me to be demotivated or dissatisfied in what I do.
Yeah.
And that applied very much to the concept of engagement. And we found that there are certain things that, when they are present, they do not necessarily create engagement in an organization. Those kind of things are very similar to what are referred to as those hygiene factors. Things like compensation, even perks fit into this. The idea that if they're there, they're wonderful, that's great, but they don't necessarily cause me to act any differently. But I take those away, and all of a sudden now they become dissatisfiers or disengagers. And we realized very clearly that what many organizations were addressing were the satisfaction elements. And the reason they were doing this is because they were easy to spot. So it's very easy to buy a foosball table, or to provide a lunch for the employees. That's wonderful, but the engagement factor is a little bit harder. And that's where we really came up with the concept of the differentiators between engagement and satisfaction. And through our survey work, we found out what those really were, what caused those to be different.
Yeah, and this was kind of a fun project, interesting project, as we were looking at our data and understanding, okay, now we know satisfaction, it's all about pay, benefits, workload, having the tools
and resources, right, yeah.
And so once we understood that pretty clearly, they're still very important. If they're not there, people tend to maybe leave your organization or might not want to join. But engagement was more about the motivational aspect of it. And so these concepts came out as we were looking at the data, and we said, well, people want to kind of grow and develop in their role. They want to be empowered or have autonomy in what they're doing. Another concept was, making a difference in your organization, feeling like you're contributing, like a sense of impact. And so as we kind of mapped these items out on the board, it was interesting to have these terms appear and these words started grouping together quite nicely until we came out with, the first letter was, meaning and purpose. So
right.
We had meaning and purpose and some of those other things. And gradually, it was funny because the terms themselves, we had to kind of, adjust a few to come up with magic, but the letters themselves came out of the meaning, autonomy, growth, impact, and connection. Do you want to talk about that process and what those letters mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And Charles, I'm glad you said we, because you were kind of one of the founders of this whole concept. The idea that we looked at it and said there are really 6 different concepts, 6 different things that create engagement in an organization. And as we listed out those 6 things, we realized actually of those 6, 2 of them were very, very similar. In fact, and then we reduced that down to 4 different concepts because we thought, well, 2 of them are very similar. The idea of purpose or meaning and impact, very similar. So the things that I do make a difference really is what it came down to. Then we realized, no, actually they are different enough. And so as we looked at the survey responses, originally we had 14 million survey responses that this came from. And as we did the analysis behind it, very clearly from the statistics that it broke down to anywhere between 4 and 6 different concepts.
Yeah.
And as we started looking at this in more depth, and in fact, Charles, I'm going to give you the credit with this one. I think we were sitting in that room and you said, actually, these kind of spell a word here.
Yeah.
And they did. They spelled the word magic, which was really fortuitous.
Yeah, we had to switch, I think, the G out. I think we had development in there. It was Matic at first, and then magic came out of it.
And I think it became pagic with purpose rather than meaning.
Right.
The whole idea here is that wasn't very attractive from a marketing standpoint.
Sure.
But really, we didn't set out to develop the acronym.
Yeah, in fact,
it developed itself.
We were thinking, man, magic is so cheesy. Do you think that's going to work? But it was so easy to remember. We thought we've got to go with it.
And that was the whole purpose. How do we help employees and supervisors and organizations remember something that's so easy to remember that they can actually continue to keep this in their minds?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and so what we found is, these concepts work both for an individual, so they have to have, understand how magic works for them and these different factors. And also as a manager, how to apply those or use those, leverage those keys to really drive engagement on their team. So what we did is we started using and measuring more directly around those topics on employee engagement surveys. We started learning more about how they're functioning, how they work at different levels. And based on that, we had a ton of content, a ton of research, employee survey data, and also a lot of psychological principles that tied into this to kind of put together the book on engagement. So hence the book Engagement Magic. So do you want to describe how that kind of came together and what the purpose of the book was?
Well, there were a few things that happened at the same time. As we looked at the field of industrial organizational psychology, we looked at motivation, we looked at all kinds of things. As you mentioned, we spent the first part of this really kind of two parallel processes. Mm-hmm. So the one side of it really is, let's look at what the literature is out there. So approached it from a very academic standpoint. Then the other piece is what does our database tell us? Mm-hmm. And what was very interesting is that database of, again, 14 million survey responses at the time. It matched very closely with what we were reading in the literature.
Yeah.
The idea that somebody needs to find purpose and they need to be able to find progress in what they're doing matched very nicely with what we had. And as we started to do this, we started assembling this data in a way that we had hoped, instead of being academic in nature, could be something that a manager could pick up. That manager would be able to know, look, if I'm trying to create an engaging or motivating environment, here are the 5 simple things that I need to understand that will create that environment. So we wrote this book, Engagement Magic. Originally, the title was Magic. And we wrote this book, Engagement Magic, with the idea that we would like to be able to help organizations, managers, and individual employees understand this concept of engagement that's become so clouded over a period of the last decade.
Yeah.
And that's how we originally started doing that.
Yeah, and the book is provides a lot of insight into this. So for one example I'm thinking of is like when you're thinking of autonomy, the opposite of autonomy is the psychological principle of learned helplessness.
Right.
Do you want to talk about how that plays out in an organization?
Yeah, there were a number of different opposites in this concept. So, for example, opposite of growth is stagnation. Mm-hmm. Opposite, as you mentioned, autonomy is this concept of the learned helplessness that exists. So just a quick example, learned helplessness is an example of that one may be when a manager, and I'm not going to go into the psychology of this, but we'll give you the clear example. The manager continues to provide very, very clear direction all of the time. So micromanagement, basically what happens. And then the manager 6 months down the road wonders why her employees can't think in terms of innovation. They're not coming up with innovative ideas. Well, it's because they've taught that. They've been taught to be helpless.
They know not to do anything without checking with their manager first.
That's
or asking
exactly
them
right.
questions. Yeah.
Some fascinating psychological concepts and studies along those lines that are actually very, very well known. But it happens in the workplace as well. Other dichotomies or other differences, polarities. For example, meaning. When people find that their job is useless, mm-hmm. and they find that there's no reason, no purpose behind what they do, they check out. And so the opposite of that is meaning. We find meaning in what we do.
Yeah, and from that, so the book was published then in 2014. That was the initial release. It was republished again 2018?
2019.
19,
right.
just this last year,
right.
The new version. And then from the initial publication of the book, what we found is we were doing engagement surveys with organizations. were giving reports to managers for their team. So if anyone that had 5 or more responses on their team, they got a report for their group, and they could see their engagement score as well. And managers were saying, okay, well, I have some data here, but I'm not quite sure about how to approach and action plan with my team, or put together a plan, or use the drive engagement essentially. And so born out of that became our Engagement Magic training, which was designed for 2 purposes. One is to help employees understand and learn how their own engagement works, so it kind of create ownership for your own engagement. And the other purpose was to empower managers with tools about how to affect engagement, how to leverage or drive engagement, and use those principles, basically apply the magic principles within their teams. And so that training's been around for multiple years now. It's a day long. Well, it's 2 sessions, half day each. But that was very effective in helping managers finally understand what engagement means and how it motivates their team.
Yeah, the real objective here was to take the concepts. So here's the punchline, right?
Yeah.
So the MAGIC is an acronym that stands for meaning, autonomy, growth, impact, and connection. Mm-hmm. So meaning is finding a sense of purpose beyond just the job itself. So there's another reason I come into work. Autonomy is to be able to create an environment in which you can be free to do your best and choose the way to do that. So a bunch of different dimensions of autonomy. Growth is basically being better tomorrow than I am today, and better than I was yesterday. So it's continued, as it mentions, growth. Impact is seeing real measurable results from what I do. So there's a reason behind what I do, which is the purpose, and I see the results of what I do, which is the impact piece. Yeah. And then finally, the C is connection. Connection is so huge, particularly right now. The idea that I'm connected to my organization. And what we were seeing is that as people read the book resonated very, very well with these folks. But the thing of it is they were saying, now, how do I as a manager implement these concepts? Mm-hmm. How do I help my employees find impact in what they do? How do I help them establish connection? And that was really the purpose of this training that was developed.
Yeah, and so I'll give you an example of one of the training activities that we do. Typically, like in the meaning section, we have an activity where we have people go through a values card sort. So in other words, there's a list of like 50 different values that you could choose from, whether it be having fun at work to having structure at work or autonomy, whatever the case is. And as people went through and sorted these cards and developed or identified the top 5 values that they really wanted to experience at work, that was really informative to them to see if they're actually experiencing their own personal values in the tasks that they did. Right. And so as an individual, you're saying, gosh, I want to experience creativity more, so I should take on additional projects. What's my action plan from here? And as managers, we would we spend time with managers helping them align some of the tasks or provide more opportunities where people can experience the meaning in their work. And so it's a very practical way of kind of taking these theories or ideas around magic and implementing them in the workplace.
Yeah, I guess the training is kind of the field guide, right? It's the how to implement these concepts that really do resonate with individuals, and they're saying, okay, that's great. Now I as a manager need to apply this. Help me do that.
Right. And then from here, the next step has been implementing, which is being released right now, the Engagement Magic online or e-learning course, which is now available. And so if you go to learn.decisionwise.com, you can attend or sign up and attend this, enroll in this course. Essentially, it's a 2-hour e-learning course, but it's really designed to be facilitated by the manager. So we want the manager to help lead the discussion or outside discussions as opposed to people just going through and clicking and watching videos.
Yeah, kind of a different approach, really a different approach. 2 ways that you can go through this. One is that an individual can just go through by him or herself. Yeah. And that is, I learned the concepts, reinforce the concepts of the book. I may or may not have read the book before, but I get a basic understanding of these concepts that help me understand what is my meaning. How do I find it in my job? If I don't have it today, how do I get it? So very, very appropriate for an individual. But it was really designed with the concept that supports a lot of our research. And that research is that an organization has a degree of impact on an individual's motivation. So that, for example, Charles, you at DecisionWise as an entity or as an organization can set the tone or the environment for you to choose to engage. But ultimately, number one, you have to choose to engage. And number two, a lot of your engagement, in fact, our research supports this very clearly, is based on not the organization, but the relationship with the manager.
Yeah.
And the manager is the one who is closest to you, not the organization.
Mm-hmm.
So very interesting. We've been able to find that people do join organizations. So, I set out to prove 2 years ago that this concept of people joining organizations and quitting managers was false. And actually, I found it is very true.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that people do join organizations, but then what keeps me around and what helps me engage is my manager.
Yeah.
And so the e-learning concept that you were just talking about was aimed at the individual, but also is structured so that a manager can take his or her employees through this as well. So I, as an employee, go through and I complete certain exercises, and then the manager can help debrief me on those exercises and help with the experiential part of that.
Yeah. And I'll give another example. This is an activity that all managers can do without the training. Within the training, there's an activity where we have the individual indicate how much of the engagement is owned by them and how much is owned by the organization.
Yeah.
So they go in and kind of put in the percent. Is it 50% me, 50% the organization, 80% me, 20% the organization? So they get to decide what that ratio is. Generally, we find it's a 50-50 proposition. You have to own your own engagement as well as...
Well, and isn't that the key here? That the idea here is what we're trying to help employees and managers understand is that there used to be this concept that an employee could sit back and say, okay, motivate me, I dare you.
Right
to the organization. And it was the organization's responsibility to create engagement. We found that the organization can set the tone, but ultimately it's up to the employee to choose to engage.
Mm-hmm.
So really the training that we're talking about is to help the employee understand, this is my responsibility, and organization understand that they need to set the tone and how to do it.
Yeah, and so as you do that, facilitate that activity as a manager, all your employees have gone through and kind of created their ratios or whatever in terms of who owns engagement. Then you get them back into a room and you say, okay, how did you reply to that question? Who said what? And somebody will say, well, I put 80% myself, 20% the organization. And someone else will say, well, I put 20% myself and 80% the organization. And so you have a good discussion around who owns what's the responsibility, and basically the outcome is everyone understands there's a portion that they own. And that's really the point you're trying to get home. But you really get a good feeling for where your employees are, how they feel, if they're more feeling kind of in charge of their own engagement or not.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So you as my manager will also understand more about me. Mm-hmm. So for example, here, disclosure. There are a couple key elements for me in Magic that weigh more for me more than others.
Yeah.
Those would be autonomy. For me, autonomy, and one of the reasons why I'm here at DecisionWise is because autonomy is so critical to me. I couldn't deal without that within another job.
Sure.
That's an important piece. So you as a manager can understand as you go through this training, as we have that conversation, you're taught to facilitate that conversation to where you can understand what's important to me about autonomy.
Yep.
And how do you as a manager help facilitate that? Where maybe autonomy may not be as important to somebody else. It may be connection. Mm-hmm. So you find out a lot about your employees in this process.
Yeah, and it's all individually kind of geared or focused, and you're helping to kind of coach and facilitate and help that to occur.
Yeah.
So I guess, Tracy, before we wrap up, anything else you want to share about the content, the book, the training, what managers can do right now to help engage their teams?
Well, I want to go back to that concept that much of my engagement as an individual is, well, first of all, let's talk about what it isn't. It isn't mm-hmm. the organization. Mm-hmm. So the organization does have some impact. So, for example, if I believe that the organization is circling the drain, meaning that they're not going to be here in another year, it's really tough for me to be engaged.
Sure.
So there are certain things that the organization does impact. Compensation, that's a satisfaction.
If there's layoffs, that's a big downer.
Absolutely, particularly during this time that we're experiencing. So that has a big impact. But really, the ability to help influence my engagement rests a lot on the shoulders of both the individual and the manager.
Yeah.
My manager can help me find those elements that maybe I can't find for myself. Mm-hmm. And so the training that we've developed, and particularly this e-learning, is designed to facilitate that process of communication that may not normally take place. It educates the manager and the employee on what engagement is and those five key elements. But it also creates a structure to where we're having some conversations that we may not have had before.
Right.
Those conversations can be related to what I, as a manager, can do to better facilitate your engagement, or what you as an employee, from my standpoint of a manager, need to do to where you can also engage yourself.
Yeah.
How do you find your own meaning in what you do? It's a different approach than teaching somebody a concept and then walking away.
Yeah. So it's a lot different than like performance management. So we're not saying, hey, you've got an underperforming employee and this is how you would address it.
Here's how you address it and have the conversation. No,
right.
It's not. That's not what it is.
Right. This is where they're performing pretty well, but we want them to achieve a higher performance or engage more in their work.
Yeah. The what's in it for me here is that I, as an employee, whereas a performance management conversation is often about, well, here's what you need to do better. Okay, so the manager improves and the organization improves, and the employee gets better. But what's in it for me as an employee here? It is how do I become more engaged in what I do? Engagement doesn't just impact me at work. So if I'm disengaged in work, and our research very clearly supports this, I'm likely to be disengaged in other areas of my life as well. I take it home with me.
Yeah.
So this is the what's in it for me here is the manager can help the employee engage in other areas as well. Even though they're not going to be talking specifically about how does this impact your marriage, they will talk about engagement and how you take that home with you.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, so it impacts their own happiness, well-being, health, so many other factors.
Well, one of the key goals here, as you've talked about, is that what comes out of this is a clear action plan. Mm-hmm. So we don't just talk about it and leave. We actually create action plans together as part of this learning. Yeah,
and that's one of the big outcomes of the whole training program, for something them to work on that's important to them makes a big difference. Great. So I want to provide one other offer here. Part of this training, there is a self-assessment, engagement magic self-assessment, where you go through, it's a 35-question survey or quiz, essentially self-assessment, where you answer certain questions along the magic model about your own engagement. And you get a real comprehensive report that shows you how much meaning you're experiencing in your job compared to our benchmark and database. The assessment's free. Anyone can go in and take it at any time. And we encourage you as a manager, it's one of the first activities in the training is to actually debrief the assessment with your people and ask them, what they learned from the assessment, what really drives their engagement. So we encourage you to take advantage of that, even if you don't take the training. That's a wonderful tool, really helps you kind of initiate and kick off that conversation. So to access the Engagement Magic Self-Assessment, go to engagementmagic.com. Scroll down the page, you'll see a link there to take the self-assessment. To preview the training, go to learn.decisionwise.com. You'll see a list of courses, one of which is the Engagement Magic Training. I want to thank everyone for joining us. We want to encourage you as well to attend our upcoming podcasts. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.